The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@opentherapyinstitute.org. Hello, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce from the Radical Center.
And I'm Andrew Hartz from the Open Therapy Institute.
And Andrew, we had a conversation about Freud a couple of weeks ago, and it was a really interesting one. You laid the groundwork for some perspectives on Freud's work. And then you recommended a book, Freud and Man's Soul by Bruno Bettelheim. And I've actually been reading that, and it's really interesting. It's really opening my mind about what Freud was all about and how we tend to think about Freud's work. And so
that was the book that made me want to study at a psychoanalytic program and get my Ph.D. from get psychodynamic training. So I actually have it right here. This is my damaged copy of this book. First of all, it's a delight to read. It's about 100 short pages, and I think you could read it in a long afternoon if you wanted to. And it's just like a delightful essay, short pages, very accessible. I should say Bruno Bettelheim is a reviled figure.
Oh, really?
And the reason is because he was involved, and I'm not exactly sure all the details of the history of this, but he was involved in promoting the idea that bad mothering caused autism, among some other things, but that turned out to not have robust evidence. And you can just imagine how many people got blamed for their child's autism when it wasn't their fault, and how awful that would feel for so many parents. And he just made a ton of enemies. He grew up in Vienna in the culture of Freud, and he's a great writer and he's really smart, but he kind of ruined his reputation, I think, with that. This book is still great, and the other book that he wrote that's really great is called The Uses of Enchantment, and it's about fairy tales and psychoanalytic interpretations of fairy tales, and it's really great. Also, it's a longer book, but this is just it makes 2 points that are really, really fascinating about Freud. One of them is about the translation, and the other is about Freud's connection to the ancient Greeks. And they're both really important, often forgotten things. When people read Freud in English, they usually get this like dense, difficult essays that are very technical in a confusing way, and people really struggle with it. So it's often surprising for people to hear that in German, a lot of people thought of Freud as an incredibly skilled writer, because that doesn't come through in the English. And part of it has to do with the way the translation was managed. Like, probably the most famous example of this is that his words id, ego, and superego. And those are the English translations, but in German, the word he used instead of ego was das Ich, which means the I or the me. So Freud used these kinds of colloquial, accessible terms. You can think of how different psychoanalysis would feel if we were thinking about the me instead of the ego. The ego is a Latin term, and it makes it more medical, scientific sounding, but it's more removed. It's less personal. And the word for the id, is the it. And in German, it's just the word for it. It's the it. So you can think about the me and the it, and how incredibly different that feels from the ego and the id. With the it is like your own unconscious is the it. It's like, what is this weird thing inside of me that's alien? And it's really evocative term. And the superego is the over me. And so you can almost kind of feel it as like an over me, but it's all these accessible terms. And a lot of these got turned into these Latinized jargon, cathexis and parapraxis. And they got these, most people that study psychology, even people who don't know what these terms mean because they have these Latin origins that are really inaccessible. So it's surprising to people. Another example of the translation issues has to do with like just the way things are phrased. Like his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, maybe his most famous book. Bettelheim argues that it would be better translated as dream interpretation.
Mm.
And you can see how different it is if it's dream interpretation. It has more magic to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's more evocative. It's kind of more of like a more mystical almost.
Mm-hmm.
And the reference about soul in the title, Freud and Man's Soul, is Freud actually used the word soul. Psyche, the word psyche means soul.
Mm-hmm.
And Freud actually used the word soul in German, which I think is seal. I'm probably mispronouncing it. But he actually used that word. And into the English translation, that was translated as mind.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
very different.
It's totally different when you're thinking about soul and dream interpretation and the me and the it. And it's just this really evocative, lively, colloquial, accessible language that's really powerful. And it gets turned into this stuff that's just totally drained of life.
It feels very medical and technical in the translations that we understand.
And confusing because you don't know what it means. And it's like, what is the it again?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like it just clicks. The thing that Bruno probably gets wrong and is important for people to know about this book is Freud, the English translation of Freud is the most authoritative translation. Okay. Second to German, it's the most important one. And that's because Freud supervised pretty much I think he literally supervised everything in the complete works.
Mm.
He was fluent in English. He wrote letters in English. He only did psychoanalysis in 2 languages, German and English. He had a lot of English-speaking patients that he did English language psychoanalysis with. In World War II, he moved to London and he died in London. He was a real Anglophile and he spoke English very well. So he was capable of supervising the translation, which he did do. But it's clear that he was focused primarily on technical accuracy of the translation and not communicating the feeling or the meaning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's what comes through in the standard edition. And now, like this change, it's probably like not fixable. This is the other thing that's like very upsetting because like if you read a version of Freud where they're talking about the me and the it's going to put you out of sync with all the psychoanalytic literature where they talk about ego and id. You kind of need to know how it was initially translated. And like you could somebody could make new translations of these words, but then it wouldn't really be that useful because you're out of step with everyone else.
So there's a need to maintain consistency, but it's helpful to understand some of the colloquial underpinnings.
Yes. And like for example, a defense, he has a really interesting article about the word, or a little blurb about the word defense, that that Freud's word was like to parry. Like in sword fighting, you parry the sword away. You kind of fend. So it's a fending off. Now, fending off has a really different connotation than the way that people often think about defense.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost conscious, and it's a little bit more active that you're kind of. So there's things like that end up being very important. The other point that he makes is like Freud's total obsession with the Greeks and Greek mythology, Greek tragedy, and Greek philosophy. His model, and Bettelheim doesn't talk about this example, but his model of id, ego, superego is really taken right out of Plato's Republic. Plato's Republics, has 3 parts of the soul, 3 parts of the psyche, and it's desire, spirit, and reason. And reason is a lot like the ego, and spirit is a lot like the superego, and desire is a lot like the id. Now, it's not a perfect 1-to-1, but it's very similar. and you think about other ideas Freud uses, like one thing that Bettelheim talks a lot about is the myth of Eros and Psyche.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like this myth that Freud is evoking. He talks about the link between Eros and Psyche, or Eros and Thanatos. Thanatos is the death drive, and Eros is the life drive. And he uses these references constantly. Obviously, Oedipus is one where Freud, the way that it got translated in American culture was this very kind of scientific theory about A, B, C, and D, whereas Freud was probably, there's reason to think that he was more loosely associating to the entirety of the story of Oedipus, including what the parents did and the whole context of the story, not
That
just
was
some very
Yeah, that was really interesting. I read that part in the book, and he talks about how when we think about the Oedipal complex, we're thinking of the story of Oedipus as the prophecy that he would kill his mother and marry his father. So there's this desire for the mother and this hostility toward the father. But in reality, what that story was really doing was there were so many layers of obfuscation of that prophecy. And so when it actually came to pass, Oedipus didn't know what he was even doing. He didn't know that the woman was
Right.
his mother or that the man was his father because of the way his life had been, the way his story went. And it was about what you don't know about yourself. It was sort of about the need to know your intentions. So it was a very different story when it was explained that way than the way that we hear that as a Freudian, concept, set of concepts.
100%. Can I actually share my screen?
Yeah, let
Can
me
I show
send it so
something?
that you can. Yeah.
Let me show, I want to share something that's
Okay.
about this. Uh, actually, I want to just, this is just like some slides. This was from a class that I taught. So let me, so this is Freud's office. I think it's a reconstruction of it. But do you see all of these figures everywhere? The
Hmm.
statues and the statuettes, all of these are all antiquities, ancient Greek, Roman, and Egyptian antiquities. And these were everywhere. So
Wow.
this is from the movie A Dangerous Method.
Hmm.
But patients complained that they were distracting.
Oh,
Because he
wow.
just was covered in this stuff. This is actually just layered up on his desk like this. So he's thinking about all these figures with all of their depth of
Hmm.
meaning. Um, this is Oedipus and the Sphinx.
Mm.
Oedipus solved the riddle of the Sphinx, and this this is at the University of Vienna, and
Mm.
that's me next to the bust of Freud. And
Mm.
this is at the bottom, it's this passage in Greek from the play Oedipus Rex. And it says, he divined the famous riddle and was the most mighty man, and was a most mighty man. And that's what Freud had
Wow.
underneath his. So he's just like unabashedly identifying with Oedipus.
Hmm.
um, and the entirety of that story. This is Psyche, and there are these amazing sculptures of Eros and Psyche.
Mm. That's
Um,
beautiful.
yeah, this is Eros and Psyche. Another one. This is Narcissus and Echo.
Mm.
Narcissism and all of that. So just to say, um, he was just immersed in this and really thinking about all of the evocative meanings about Sophocles and Plato and Eros and Psyche and Narcissus and Echo and these myths being so. Bettelheim makes those points just really, really beautifully and goes into more detail about other of his ideas. And it's if you're going to read one book about psychoanalysis, I think that's the one that I'd say because it's short and it's just a beautiful book.
Yeah, the difference between talking about the mind and the soul is just a it's such a massive qualitative difference. And I think that sums up a big part of the opening of my mind as I'm reading this, like how I'm reading Freud differently or seeing Freud differently through this perspective, realizing that there was such a difference in translation of some of these words.
Yeah, and the soul is like deeper, more personal, it's more complex. The mind, like cognitive theorists, people who are interested in the mind, they were thinking about how many letters can you memorize in a sequence, and like attention and long-term memory, and they, the mind just evokes like how good at you are at math, like it's just like that type, and the soul is like feeling and suffering and depth and mysticism, and I think it's probably truer to what we actually are. It's more, but it's not a scientific feeling. Um, so
Yeah,
it
it's
could,
not as categorizable and medical. It doesn't translate. It's like, and since reading this, I've been thinking a lot about the difference between psychology and mental health. We're talking
right.
about the same thing differently. The framing
Yes.
matters. So it's really fascinating.
Well, and I just wrote an article for Discourse Magazine last week that was about like ancient theories about healing and fulfillment. And it's not like these are new questions about like what leads to suffering and what leads to fulfillment. I mean, that's what Buddha spoke about. That's what Jesus spoke about. That's in throughout the Bible. It's in every religion. And it's not like this is like a new thing. And a lot of the ideas in psychology that end up being the most effective, having the most staying power, are taken from these ancient traditions. And they're kind of, but I wonder how much is lost by turning them into these operationalizable variables and studying them. And then they kind of get drained of their life a little bit.
Hmm.
Even if, yes, we know that this is true and it helps people, but it kind of, it's maybe less lively,
Hmm.
and engaging. I had a couple other books.
Hmm.
Okay. So I don't know what we'll be able to get to. We probably can't get to all of these, but this is also just like this is not like, these are not like unique books for me to pick. But Freud, A Life for Our Time by Peter Gay is the biography to read of Freud. And the best thing about that book is it intersperses the details of his life with the paper he wrote or the book he wrote. And so it shows you could actually just skip all the biographical sections and just read the sections summarizing his work. And you'd get a picture of each paper he wrote in sequence and how it was a development or change from what came before. And the summaries he has of these different books are just really succinct, really accurate, really well done. So here's a 2-page summary of the interpretation of dreams, or here's like here's a few pages on, whatever is on his case studies on every different thing. And so it's actually like really indispensable if you just want to see the scope of Freud's work and how it emerges over time. And related to that, Peter Gay also has this reader, the Freud reader, and it's just got sections of pretty much all of them. You get an incredibly good feeling of the scope of Freud's work. If you're not reading the complete works, that's probably second best, because it's just highlights some of the most interesting things that he did. I personally, in terms of what therapists read and like, I think most therapists tend to like these are the papers on technique. And you can get them. It's a series of papers. They talk about things like transference and countertransference. They talk about the clinical method and free association and how he actually practiced. And those are, I think, very perceptive, very interesting. My favorite articles by Freud, one that I think is the best one to read as an individual article, and interrupt me anytime if you want to, is the case study Anna O is really, really good. And she's the first psychoanalytic patient. And it wasn't Freud's patient. She was Joseph Breuer's patient. And Joseph Breuer was kind of his mentor. And it's really illuminating. I need to drink some water. It's really illuminating about how psychoanalysis emerged. You know, Freud, people don't know this, but Freud was trained in hypnosis. And he studied in France under somebody named Charcot to learn the hypnotic method. And there was lots of interest in the power of hypnosis to do all kinds of fascinating things, especially like it was a replacement for anesthesia during surgery. And people could get a limb amputated with no anesthesia, but with hypnosis.
That's incredible.
And so it was incredible. It was really fascinating to people. But this treatment was you kind of a treatment for hysteria where you'd be hypnotized, you'd recover your traumatic memory, you would and then you'd have this catharsis and your symptoms would go away. So what happened with Anna O was Breuer goes to give her hypnotic treatment and it doesn't stick. He's having a hard time hypnotizing her. So they just say, well, why don't we just talk about it? And I actually think, if I'm remembering right, it was Anna O's suggestion, not Breuer. She's like, well, why don't I just talk as if I'm hypnotized? And that's where free association came from. It's just this very loose style talking that's kind of like hypnosis, but different. But it was still the same thing. You're going to find the memory, express it, have a catharsis and symptoms. But you get to see how that happened with this first patient. And that's where psychoanalysis came from. I don't particularly like Freud's other case studies, I'll say. They're bizarre. His inferences that he makes are wild leaps that don't make sense to the reader, especially in modern times. Like they're just stuff you would never do with the patient. And I don't know why he picked I think he maybe was interested in the most strange or exotic cases of bizarre stuff or something, but they're fascinating. They're weird, but I wouldn't recommend them. If you want it, like, they're not manuals for a therapist.
Okay.
I'll say. I'd say the papers on technique, I think, have done a better job of holding over time, although those still aren't perfect by any means. There's a couple other essays that I think get forgotten with Freud that I just want to mention if people want to read Freud. One of them is his essay on the uncanny.
Okay.
And he talks about things like déjà vu. And like, why is it that people get the feeling of déjà vu? And, you know, his thinking there is like, it's something that you've fantasized about. So you actually did see it before in your mind. You unconsciously fantasized about it, and now you're seeing it. So that's when you get this feeling of déjà vu. But he talks about other types of like uncanny sensations that people have and experiences people have, and he interprets them psychoanalytically. It's very interesting.
That sounds interesting.
Another one that's really interesting is an article about the family romance.
Okay.
The family romance refers to this fantasy that kids often have, and it's all over children's literature, that their parents aren't really their parents, and their actual parents are wizards or Jedis or a king, like King Arthur. Or it's in Superman. They're superhero aliens. It's in a lot of stuff, and it's that, you know, where does this come from, and why is this such a common trope for kids?
Wow, that's really interesting. I can think of a lot of reasons why that might be. It's fascinating.
Oh, I'm curious what you think because you haven't read it. So,
well, it's kind of like the banality of adult life is really gray and boring, and your parents, you must be destined for greater stuff than this. You know, the child is full of potential and possibility, and their parents represent one limitation of possibility. one
Yeah.
limited reality. So the desire to think of oneself as being made from something greater is kind of an expression of the wish to be something better or more impressive or live a more adventurous, interesting life.
Yes.
Mm.
And it happens at the age when kids start to get disillusioned with their parents. Like
Mm.
it's that when they're young, the parents are so idealized, and then when they start to get disillusioned, that's the age when they read that YA fiction where it's always the
Mm.
family romance somehow in every story.
Wow, that is
Uh,
so interesting.
yeah. See, he has all of these fascinating theories, little theories that kind
Mhm.
of get forgotten. Um, I don't like the psychosexual theory. I've been kind of like clear of it. I think it's very bizarre and not clinically useful. But for Freud, his theory of psychosexuality was everything. And
Mhm.
and he would break with people in his circle over minor, what appear from a modern eye, minor differences of opinion
Mhm.
about the psychosexual theory. Like Otto Rank says, actually, I think birth trauma is a really important part of this sequence.
Mhm.
No, he's out.
Mhm.
Alfred Adler says, I think like, was it like basically like insecurity about penis size? That was
Mhm.
like something that he thought was like very important. They broke over that. Like he
Really?
broke with Jung over that. Like it's every time that he broke with somebody, it tended to be. I'm trying to think if there's exceptions to this, but it was like you had to agree with the psychosexual theory basically in its entirety,
I
or
wonder
you
why he
weren't
was
a
guarding
psycho.
it so closely. He was making heretics out of everybody who had a different opinion.
He was so fiercely, and I think it's not clinically useful. It doesn't have evidence. It's super bizarre.
Mhm.
And it's like, I think for somebody like Jung, who's like, sure, the Oedipus myth might be one myth people live out, but that's not the myth everybody necessarily needs to live out, which I
Mhm.
think is probably what most people think today.
Mhm.
Maybe it's a salient metaphor for some people, but it's not for most. The last one that I think is just another really interesting one, and it's the last like uh, essay by Freud that I'll just recommend because these are short, so you can like find them and read them, and they're not epic. Is Screen Memories. A
Screen memories?
screen memories, yeah, and a screen memory is often it's like the first memory that you have,
Mhm.
and it has a photographic quality to it,
Mhm.
and often you see yourself in it.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that means it didn't happen.
Interesting.
So a lot of times when people talk about their earliest memory, it has this kind of photographic quality and they can
Mhm.
see themselves in it. So his thinking is like, this is very common, but what this is it's some type of like foundational dream
Mhm.
that says something. So it's another just, he has these insights about memory or deja vu. And I love that he wrote a whole book on jokes and humor and how it works. And I love that he's interested in dreams and jokes and these observations of why do people do these. Like he's tying together really interesting things. And I do think it has to do something with like the medical worldview and the steam engine model and hypnosis and the Greeks, and he's tying this all together in this really interesting way that can sometimes make for really insightful, interesting reading, and sometimes just goes off the deep end.
Mhm.
Totally over bizarre. I mean, in one of his books was about famous books, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. And he talks about how little things like slips or not remembering something or misremembering something and how that's related to the unconscious. But one of his parts of that book, it's a very interesting book, but one of his parts is like, if you ask somebody to like randomly think of a number like 256, that number has some kind of psychoanalytic meaning that you can like break down into like, okay, well, why'd you say 256? It's because of all, and it's kind of, I mean, it's not falsifiable, which is frustrating, but it just seems like a bit of a stretch.
Mm.
It's kind of like, and you can see how if people really want to think about how every number has some meaning, they could be like, well,
Mm.
in February this happened, and or, I don't know, you just like, and then you make something. I just so he kind of overstates things a lot, and it goes into weird territory. Um, there's one other book that I want to be sure to talk about, and then you can let me know how many of the others we can get to. But that's this. It's not this particular one necessarily, but a good psychoanalytic dictionary is very valuable if you're interested in psychoanalysis because it'll have succinct summaries of all the psychoanalytic terms. Now, I think there's something like 36 English language psychoanalytic dictionaries.
Wow,
Um,
that's a lot.
it's a lot, and they really vary. This one is by Salman Akhtar. And I like this one, and I got this one because it's the definitions are like short and succinct and kind of fairly understandable. Others like Laplanche is a famous one, but he has these kind of long philosophical essays about each topic. So it's just not to say that's not valuable, but if you want to, so they're very different. And I find this more helpful. And it's just like if I think am I understanding this concept right, or you're reading something by Freud that he doesn't define, or it's in another work, you could just come back and like the definition will be there and it'll kind of explain it in an interesting way. So I find that to be really, really indispensable. And actually, if I can, I'll just say these last two books. I'll be really quick. These are not just about this is like a very widely read book by psychoanalytic psychologists and psychoanalysts, Freud and Beyond by Mitchell and Black. And it has two chapters on Freud, and then it's got chapters on Anna Freud and Harry Stack Sullivan and Melanie Klein and Fairbairn and Winnicott and Erik Erikson and Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg and Hans Luold. And it's just like, those are all names that psychoanalysts are all going to know, those names. And what their basic theory is. And this just summarizes each of them. So like the big figures in post-Freudian analysis, post-Freudian psychoanalysis, they're summarized really well. And there's some stuff on Freud too. That's okay. I wouldn't, that's not my favorite part of the book. I think the other chapters are much better. And the last one, though, another really, really widely read book on psychoanalysis, which is Nancy McWilliams' Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. And this is something that I think everybody at a psychoanalytic program will read. Every psychoanalyst will read. It's very, very widely read. Oh, actually, let me say one thing about this book going back here. One of the people that's not in this book is Jung. And Jung is the Jungian world and the rest of the psychoanalytic world just seem to be in different planets. And I think in my PhD program, I don't think I had one reading by Jung.
Really?
And it was a psychoanalytic program. Because they're kind of like, he's still in a different world. But we did read like a lot of Melanie Klein and Anna Freud and Winnicott and Fairbairn and Heinz Kohut. We read all these other people that aren't as well known outside of psychoanalysis, but they're huge figures within the psychoanalytic world. But I just think it's interesting to people outside who kind of would think Jung's number two. And he's really not. If anybody is second to Freud, I'd say it's probably Melanie Klein, who's not as well known, but has a huge influence on the field. This book, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, it's basically about, it outlines the major defense mechanisms and the core psychoanalytic terms and something about character analysis, which is like different character types: narcissistic personality, histrionic personality, psychopathic personality. And it just says something about what those personality types are like, what what it's like to treat them, what's happening psychologically with them, and that sort of thing. So
Mm.
it's a really good it's just a very widely read thing for actual practitioners. So if you read all 6 of those books, then you'll be in good shape you'll know quite a bit about psychoanalysis.
You know, it's amazing. This is sort of a side note, but it's really interesting getting this reading list and just this overview of some books about Freud and about these big figures. I'm reminded of how little we were taught in a master's in counseling program about foundational psychological theories and figures. It's really incredible. I wish we'd been taught more of this. I wish that I'd been exposed
I
to more of
know.
this. We're just given sort of an overview. And that's a
I
lot of counselors out there. That's a lot of people
I
doing counseling.
I know. I know. And there's a couple reasons for it. One of them is, and this is kind of the subtext of our podcast, is the more as social justice crowds everything else out,
Yeah.
what's getting bumped from the syllabus, from the syllabi, it's these books.
Yeah.
And that's something where the younger people, the college students, they have no idea how many gems they are not learning because somebody says, "Hey, you know what? Those are all white people."
Yeah.
You know, I think every psychoanalyst that I mentioned was white, and they're mostly male. It's very male heavy. Although psychoanalysis has a lot of very prominent women, very influential women, and it's not that they had to do that for affirmative action. They've always been very influential in psychoanalysis, and but you know, people could say, "Oh, there's not enough people of color. Let's get rid of it." And then what gets bumped? These books. And they don't know that the students don't know, like, oh wow, we could have learned this incredible thing and we didn't because we had to hit some quota or we had to hear our 300th lecture on white privilege, and that's what you miss. So it's there's something really sad about it.
Hmm.
Another reason why this stuff probably doesn't get taught is because there's a lot of programs just don't have any psychoanalytic component. They're all cognitive behavioral or another
Hmm.
approach. And this stuff it's really difficult to learn. I mean, one of the reasons why I went to a psychoanalytic program, it's psychodynamic. I never say psychodynamic because people don't know what that means. So I always say psychoanalytic, even though it's not a psychoanalysis training program. But I went because this stuff is not easy to learn. You really have to I think to really get it, it's helpful to be in your own analysis. It's helpful to be supervised doing analytic therapy. That's when you really see how this stuff works.
Hmm.
It's kind of like you learn by doing, and the concepts are really easily misunderstood or misapplied. Um, and so it really is valuable to have as something that keeps getting taught. But I think it's just taught less and less because people are taught manualized therapies that are simpler. Um, and a lot of the concepts in here aren't it's not like they don't have a lot of evidence. So it's not like it's hard to study some of Freud's claims, even the interesting ones. The family romance, it's like, how do you study that?
Hmm.
Um, so
Well, and it's not conducive to sort of a training mill, which is what I think of some of these programs as. The one I went to and others that I hear about had this feel of we're just we're sort of just teaching you the skills to become a kind of technician. You're
yeah,
going to plug and play. And so I did say, even some of my earlier critiques, I studied psychology in undergrad and I found it so fascinating. And we, we chewed on some of these thinkers and concepts in classes I had in undergrad. So one of the reasons why I was excited to study applied psychology in the graduate level was because I wanted to get back into that. I had this sense that there was a lot there that I wanted to learn about. And I came in and it was all social justice and CBT and diagnosis and, smart treatment planning and things
Yeah,
like that. So
yeah,
you
yeah.
do, and it's interesting that the spirit that's being lost in that is that same spirit of mystery and soul and magic that you're pointing to as you talk about Freud. Like there is this more methodical and the psychosexual side that we think of when we think of Freud. There is that, but there's also this other thing. There's also all of this other depth and this curiosity and indefinable soul kind of stuff that is lost in those in the translation that we are receiving, and it's also being lost in the study and the education of mental health professionals.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and there's so much value to it. It is kind of like the weird thing, which we should have a podcast on this, but the plug and play, as you said, where you're just a technician, you do the diagnosis, then you apply the psychotherapy in a mechanical way. Um, that's what some people think is evidence-based. Um, but that stuff's probably going to be done by AI.
Mm-hmm.
I think like what you can get apps and other types of things where if that's all you're doing is rehashing the manual to the best of your ability, I think AI can do that much cheaper and maybe even better. The
Mm-hmm.
thing that's valuable is the human connection and using insight in ways that are harder to capture, harder to measure, thinking about things in deeper, looser ways, and really leaning into the soul or leaning into the subtle piece, or it's not to say that it has to inherently be some mystical thing, but leaning into that type of stuff. Um, that I think that's actually probably where the field is going to need to go if it wants to survive, because the other stuff, I think, in a decade will very likely be done by AI.
Yeah, I think that's probably what's coming with the online chat therapists. The next thing is going to be a computer.
Like a video simulation of a person who says things and seems like they're listening, and but they can plug and play. I mean, if that's all you're doing is saying do a journal, upload it, and then I can give you some stock thoughts that are the standard, like that's AI.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think some of these concepts, they're it's actually, I'll say psychoanalysis is a sharper tool. It's a very sharp tool, but it's very easily misused. It's only if you try to get psychoanalysis, somebody working with these same ideas who's nuts or sadistic or manipulative or whatever, they can do a lot of damage. It's really who's using it.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's somebody who is attuned and insightful and collaborative and skilled and means well and is patient-centered, I think this stuff can be really, really transformative. But if it's used in this aggressive way, it gets lost. One other thing that I think is important, that after World War II, this is the last thing else, after World War II, the psychoanalytic community was so much in the German-speaking world, and a lot of the people were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But even the non-Jewish ones, a lot of them fled. Okay, and they went to the UK and they went to the US, especially New York. And one of the real treasures of New York psychoanalytic world was that these people who had been who were analyzed by Freud or were in that culture were then coming to New York and setting up psychoanalytic institutes here. There was or to London. And so in the English speaking world, it really inherited this tradition. And it's crazy when I was in grad school and it'd be like, oh wow, my supervisor was taught by the person who was there, or something like crazy. It's like so there was this incredible continuity. And it's a real tragedy that such a tragedy to watch that world become so politicized, and I think lose its connection to its roots, because it's a treasure to have those things. And I'm very concerned about where it's going from now.
Yeah, it's a real loss, and a real missing of what's important.
Yeah.
Would you send me your reading list and I can put it in the description for this
Oh,
video?
sure, sure, sure. Yeah, it's 6 books, and then I think I
Okay.
cited like 4 Freud
All
articles.
right. I think that's
I can
great.
do that.
I bet a lot of
Okay.
people will be interested in following up on that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, yeah. Especially Bettelheim's an easy place to start.
I
So
want to read the other Bettelheim book you were talking about, the uses of enchantment. So I know that's a
yeah,
side conversation, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've been enjoying Freud and Man's Soul,
yeah, yeah.
and I want to read that too. Well, so thank you
It's
very
great.
much, Andrew. It's been an
Okay,
interesting conversation, and I'm sure a lot of people will learn quite a bit.
great. Thanks. Good
Thanks.
talking.
You too.